Here is our theme song for a really great podcast. I'm Billy Montana and I co-host Finding My Voice, from the yucky to the funny with Kristen. Toepfer Kristen was a model and walked at New York Fashion Week. And suddenly she fell ill and had a hemorrhagic stroke. She couldn't talk for 2 years. She would watch the birds in her backyard. Doctor said she wouldn't make it. Her major victory was walking from her front door to a mailbox. Now she can walk 3 miles. She's a miracle. She's resilient and a tough Jersey girl. She is the voice of the voiceless. She has a book coming out called Finding My Voice. She is a stroke and aphasia advocate. Take a listen to this informative and real fun show.
Welcome to Finding My Voice, from the funny to the yucky, no holding back podcast, featured by Kristen Toepfer. And today we have a special guest, John Church, Kristen's husband. As you know, we have been working with Kristen for a long time on her stroke and aphasia advocacy, and we've heard a lot about John, but today we're going to focus on John and get his insight on what he's been through, and from his perspective, what Kristen's been through as well. So Kristen, first we're going to start off with you. How does it feel to have your book finally complete?
It feels great, Bill.
12 chapters honoring your September 12th birthday. The journey from sitting and watching birds to becoming a published author. How does that feel?
Feels great. Excited.
Yes, you should be, and you should be very proud of yourself. Why is it important to have John here today?
So everybody can see how much I'm proud of him, because he's my rock.
Yes. And what role has he played in this book becoming reality?
I'm lucky girl that he stood by me.
Yes, for sure. How much of your recovery story is also his story?
I know.
Well, you're the one that went through it.
Yeah, but you went through it.
Your own
John went
story.
through it too, yeah. All right, so we're going to do, what's the one thing readers will learn that might surprise them about your book?
I know, you're just going to have to read
Good answer.
it.
Okay, John. The night that everything changed. Take us back to September 11th, 2018, around 3 a.m. You got a phone call from Kristen. Walk us through what happened.
Yeah, well, I was at work because I work nights, still do. Got a call from Kristen, like you said, about 3 a.m. And the words, that were coming out weren't quite right. And at first I thought she may have just be having like a panic attack or something. She just kept saying something was wrong. And then it turned into like my gum is numb, and it was just like a little weird, as that conversation went on. So I told the rest of my team, at work, like, listen, I gotta go home and see what's going on here, which was, I guess half intuition and half luck too, because sometimes, I could see it, Kristen, maybe just try to go to sleep. It wasn't so obvious, that that I knew what was going on at all. So it could have gone either way that night.
So what were your first thoughts when she called you, besides like what her voice sounded like? What was your
my first thoughts were, she just woke up, maybe had a bad dream, was having like a panic attack or something, and kind of wanted to talk about it.
So you really had no idea how serious it was at that moment?
No clue.
And how far away were you from home?
Only about 12 minutes.
Yeah. So you rushed home, you took her to Hackettstown Medical Center. What was going through your mind during that drive?
Well, I ended up calling an ambulance for her that night. Um, by the time I got home, I couldn't get her out of the bed, not under my own power, and she couldn't do it at that point either. It already
Hmm.
progressed pretty quickly. Um, the ambulance came and had to take her, and they were already like hinting around, this might be a stroke. She has some of the symptoms, but some of the other symptoms weren't quite present. So at that point, still wasn't sure what was going on.
So going back to that night when you said that you couldn't like move her under your own power, everything, like what did she look like? What was like? Were you scared? What was the kind of condition that you were in that you saw her in? Was it panic? Were you like looking at her and was she just like? Did you know it was? Did you still at that point know that it was like really serious, or you didn't know it was serious, or you weren't sure?
No, I mean, at that point, it was serious enough for me to call 911,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't know why, other than, she was pretty out of it at that point, and
Right.
I couldn't get enough out of her to get her up and moving, and I certainly couldn't carry her. So, it was
So,
it was serious enough at that point to call 911, but I had no idea what was going on.
and at that point, even the paramedics didn't know if she for sure had a stroke.
Yeah, they seemed very on the fence about it. They said they were going to call it on the way in. Just okay, but they weren't saying, this is a stroke and we're calling the stroke code. There wasn't any of that yet.
At the point when you got home, were you able to? Was she able to talk to you?
No, no, it
Okay.
was it was sounds.
Okay. So they get her to the hospital. They did a CT scan, discovered the stroke and bleeding. What did the doctors tell you?
Well, I mean, that was kind of a confusing time because I went out into the waiting room. Um, they came and got me, and were in my mind, they're asking me about a helicopter. And I'm like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. She was never on any helicopter. But what they're really telling me was we need to get her on a helicopter and get her over to, another facility that can treat this.
So you're
I'm
just
like,
kind of
oh,
like in
you know,
you're just kind of like in shock at this point.
absolutely. I did not expect that, to the point
Yeah.
where, I thought they were asking me if she was on a helicopter.
And what were you, besides the confusion, what were you feeling? Was it setting in or not setting in?
No, I mean, I couldn't say it was setting in because I didn't know what all this was going to entail, at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she was 36 at the time. Having a stroke certainly wasn't on, our radar,
Exactly.
by any stretch of the imagination. So even at that point, my own like just education and what my thoughts of a stroke were, it didn't really match up with reality either. So, at that
Right.
point, I was kind of rolling with the punches and just seeing what happens next.
So walk us through that moment when she's actually being airlifted to, what was it, Overlook Hospital?
Yeah, they sent me ahead first because they said she was going to beat me there
Right.
no matter what. Um, and still, I was. They were telling me, that she was going to Overlook, and all I heard was like Morristown somehow. So I ended up driving to the wrong hospital. Running around there trying to find trying to find her. I ended up having to
Mhm.
call the emergency room in Hackettstown again. Be like, where did she go? And like they said, I told you Overlook. I'm like, right, Overlook, got it. And then I had to put in the GPS to go to Overlook. But also during this time, I'm calling, like her brother. I had to wake up her dad. Like something's going on here. They're putting her on a helicopter. Has to be
Yeah, you call.
serious. And
Yeah, you call family members because they just don't put you on a helicopter because everything's fine.
right.
Uh, so, what was the worst thing a doctor said to you that night?
Well, that night, believe it or not, things were pretty quiet until 5 a.m. the next morning. I slept in the waiting room, and one of the doctors came to get me. or one of the nurses, I guess, came to get me, woke me up, and said, "You need to come back and talk to the doctor and see Kristen." And I asked, like, "Well, is she okay?" And they said, "Well, not really." So they certainly didn't sugarcoat it that morning.
Right.
As I get back there, the surgeon was already there, and he told me that one of the nurses noticed just the slightest difference between her pupils, which is an amazing job on their part, because it's, you know, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning for them, and they noticed this minor little thing, but that meant that her brain started to swell, and that they were going to have to do a surgery. As the doctor's explaining it to me, I'm just like, well, go, hurry up, and go ahead, do your thing, save her
Mhm.
life. You know,
Yeah.
but that was a tough morning, because then I had to call the family again and be like, listen, she's gonna have major brain surgery in like the next 20 minutes. Everybody might want to get here, because the doctors, he didn't sugarcoat it then either. He's like, this might be it.
So
Um,
from all my talking with Kristen and research I've done, correct me if I'm wrong, but did, did the neurosurgeon tell you to set your expectations that she might not even wake up? Like, how do you process hearing something like that about your high school sweetheart?
yeah, I mean, you don't process it really. I mean, you just don't. Um, and then even the challenge of having to call everybody and repeat it a couple of times, it was very hard to get out. It was, you kind of wanted to run and hide from it a little bit, and it wasn't a short surgery either. We had to sit there for a couple hours, just to hear anything. So it was pretty torturous, for sure.
Yeah, I can only imagine the waiting process of not knowing whether she was going to make it or not make it. And now at this point, you know the gravity of it. So, how was like when you're trying to communicate with family, what's their reactions and how are you holding it all together?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of halfway hold it together, right? I mean, you're kind of a wreck, but you're kind of still, trying to live through it. Um, they're asking questions that I didn't know the answers to. You know,
Hmm.
um, I think a lot of us jumped the gun a little bit, when she came out of that surgery, asking questions like, is she going to be able to talk? And, the doctor like really knocked us back at that point. We're like, you guys are way ahead of, where she's at right now. You got to set your expectations a lot less, that she might not even make it through this thing, let alone talking about talking and moving and walking and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's just one baby step at a time, which it turned out to be. But like at that point, I could only imagine that you're wondering how this happened. Was there a moment where like you broke down, or were you just like too like adrenaline filled that you're just like moving forward without really even emotionally processing what's going on?
Yeah, the emotional stuff came a little bit later, than that day. Certainly over the next couple of days, though, when the surgery was over, it went as well as it could have gone. But at that point, she was fully comatose and on a respirator, and that's when the doctors, were telling us to manage our expectations a little bit, that she might not come out of this.
Yeah. So, let's go to like what happened after that. So she was in a coma with a breathing tube, right?
Yep.
And you're probably just saying to yourself, I just want to talk to her again. So tell us about those days when you knew she couldn't talk. That had to be like extremely like frustrating and difficult, I could only imagine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you realize some of the important things, in a relationship too. it might sound strange and it might sound bizarre, but I would have been happy if it was just like her head in a jar that could talk to me, fluently, like we used to talk to each other.
Right.
It sounds bizarre and strange, but
Mm.
I would have loved to have had that.
Yeah.
And she was, we were going through life's path, strolling along just fine. She had her little set of obligations and duties, and I had mine, and the split of labor in the household and stuff like that. So that, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know, that she did, with the vet and some bills and stuff like that.
Right. So all her responsibilities that she took care of without you even like, not that you didn't know about it, but kind of took maybe for granted a little bit. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, did you did you find that you had like a new appreciation for what she had done uh, that you weren't really kind of aware of, or
Sure, our dog was getting old at the time. Um, he was on all kinds of medications. I had no clue what that was. I had to call the vet to figure that out in the midst of, dealing with all this turmoil. Um, I didn't even know that we had a water bill. I thought that was just part of taxes or something. So my water got shut off for $38. I had to have a family member go down to the actual water authority and turn it back on, in the midst of, dealing with her being in a coma and, fighting for her life.
yeah. Um, so while you were sitting there while she was in the coma in the very, very beginning, like the first few days, did you have any false expectations? Were you thinking, like she's gonna get out of this in a couple of days? Were you starting to wonder, is she ever gonna talk again? Like, is she gonna survive? Like, take me through that. Like, what was going through your
Yeah,
head?
I mean, I found my mind going, all over the place very quickly from, worst case scenario to best case scenarios to, what the doctor's saying and what, family is saying. And it's, it's almost difficult to get locked into one thought with all that going on. So sleeping was, very difficult, just I didn't eat, for those few days at all, barely slept, didn't come home, just stayed in the waiting room. Um, but yeah, and a lot of that was alone time. So, your racing thoughts are, it's pretty significant. You're almost hoping for the doctors to tell you something, that you can kind of latch onto a little bit, instead of thinking of all these different scenarios from, snapping awake and being okay to this is life now, or worse.
Yeah, I could only imagine. So when you're sitting there and you're going through all these things, like, were you so did you have like certain like visiting hours where you're only allowed to see her a certain period of time, and then the rest of the time you were just sitting in the waiting room, or how did that work?
I was able to see her whenever I wanted. So I did a lot of back and forth, spent some time with her, had to go out to like the family room, tell everybody, any kind of update that there was, or nothing,
Right.
but a lot of times, the family and everybody would leave at 6, 7, 8 o'clock. And I would just go back there and hang out with her for, hours until I felt hopefully tired enough to try to sleep on the couch in the waiting room.
So while you're sitting next to her while she's in this coma, like, did you talk to her? Did you like try to talk to her? Like, what were you doing? Or did you just sit there?
Sure, sure. I told her that it probably would have been easier if it was me because she knew everything that was going on at the house and everything, and she knew all
Right.
the responsibilities. Like I think, you might have been able to handle this a little bit better. I don't know. But in an ICU, the nurses are only 2 patients per nurse, so they're in and out a lot. And I got to give credit to that team for not only catching some of the medical stuff, but just the attention they gave her and the attention they gave me.
Right. So how long was it before like the first signs of like her eyes opening or maybe like hand movements? Like when did that happen?
Yeah. It was a slow process over weeks. There was no snap wake up moment at all. It was her left hand moving a little bit, to um, crying a little bit, to moving the leg a little bit, and that kind of progressed to moving her left arm more deliberately. Yeah, and that came to moving her left leg more deliberately. Her right side was still 100% down, and
Hmm.
speech was still 100% down, but she started to move her head a little bit. She tried to open her eyes, but with the surgery, they were swollen. She couldn't open them even if she wanted to.
Did you ask her
But
anything?
there,
Like,
then you started getting some more noises that weren't quite crying and weren't quite words. To mumbles, to incoherent words, to it progressed like that over weeks. There was no, okay, I'm back, guys. It didn't happen that way.
so when you were sitting there, like, did you ask her things like, "Can you hear me?" or "Can you hear what I'm saying?" or "Do you understand me?" or and like what
No,
was
it was very general. It was very general. Um, just some updates and kind of like current events almost, as calmly as I could.
right?
And then just some moments where I'm like, I wish I could just talk to you for 5 minutes just so I could figure some of this stuff out. And, some stuff like that, some, half joking.
So when she finally came out of the coma with no speech, no movement in her right arm, very little in her right leg, what was your reaction?
I mean, we took everything as a win,
Right.
because especially me and maybe, some of her friends and family had more of a understanding of what a stroke was. But I didn't, it wasn't on our radar. It wasn't something we thought about. It wasn't something that I even knew much about. Honestly, I knew it as like an obscure concept, not as like a thing that could happen. But we took everything as a win. And the doctors, they didn't really give us much either. They were at that point they were still telling us to manage, how much we expect and stuff like that. That she's nowhere near out of the woods.
So at this point, are you still fearing that she might not make it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was weeks before the doctor started to let up a little bit.
And what? So the setbacks that nobody talks about. She was only home one day in November before having a seizure and needing another surgery. How did that feel?
Well, she went from Overlook into a residential physical therapy, occupational therapy, inpatient place.
Hmm.
Um, Finally got her out after, I'm not even sure how many weeks, probably over a month, of intensive inpatient therapy. Got her home one day. We were sleeping. Her dad came over, and maybe about midnight, 1 a.m., somewhere around there, she just started violently shaking, which scared the crap out of me because, we still haven't calmed down yet, at all from all of this. We were still very high strung. So I get it to like the top of the stairs. We call 911 again. Um, the emergency room doctors aren't quite equipped for all that. They didn't quite know what to do, so they're trying to call the surgeon and all this other stuff. They said bring her over to Overlook. We'll check her out, but by 6 a.m. that morning, she was going back into surgery. They figured out that she had like an infection underneath, the incisions, and it was at that point there was no bone, so it was just brain tissue at that point that was had an infection on it, which is pretty devastating.
Yeah, I guess like at that point in time, you're probably sitting there like very scared because she can't communicate either, and you just don't even know like were you probably sitting there thinking like, is this it? Is she dying? That go through your head?
Yeah, like I said, we never settled down yet. We just got her home, and we're back at Overlook, and just having to walk into that place again, going into the same waiting room that we were at for weeks. And again, it's an hours long surgery, waiting to hear how it went.
Yeah. So what was it like for you when you say that it was starting from scratch? So what
Yeah, well,
was,
I mean, she was in the hospital recovering from that surgery.
Mhm.
Um, it was a few days at least. Had to be like 6 or 7 days at a minimum, that they kept her there just managing the IV antibiotics and the incision itself and just, the surgery. But then right from there, a lot of the progress she made in the rehab facility, kind of got pushed away, erased a little bit, one from the infection, the surgery, and then just laying around for, 7, 8, 9 days, whatever it was in a hospital bed. It was almost starting from scratch at that point.
Yeah. When she was going through this and you're going through this, like what did you actually had to do for like work? Like did you just because obviously, one of the things that like we haven't talked about is, I mean, obviously she's not working, but like how did that whole because she's with having this responsible job at UPS for almost 20 years, and then you were working at UPS too, right?
Yep.
So how did that whole thing play out?
Yeah. I mean, I started that process pretty early. That was like a day or two after the stroke. I called her boss, said, hey, I don't know, she's gonna be out a while. I didn't really know what to say at that point.
Right.
And I started a disability claim with I'll figure the paperwork out when I can, kind of thing. I
Exactly.
had to explain to him over the phone that she's not going to be able to do this for a while. If
Were
you
they,
need
under-
anything, she's at Overlook.
were they understanding about it?
For the most part, yes, yes. As time kind of went on, they wanted a little bit more documentation, but certainly for the first few weeks, they were.
Right. And how about you? Like, how did that affect your job?
It's kind of undescribable, really. I had to take some time off, just so I could stay at the hospital with her. But I'm going back and forth after, a few weeks. I'm doing the back and forth thing. I go to work and I got to drive to Overlook, and I go home and I sleep for a little bit to go to work, to go back to Overlook. I
Right.
leave
Right.
there to go to work and, sleep a little bit, go back to work, go back to Overlook, sleep a little bit. That process continued straight through, rehab. I think I only missed maybe 1 or 2 days when I just kind of was completely out of energy. But
How are you even able to focus on work?
surprisingly, at least after the acute stuff and, the doctors eased up a little bit, um, it kind of helped.
Kind
There
of
was moments when I
distracting?
was able to, just focus on work a little bit. Brief moments of where you almost for
Right.
minutes at a time, but it's a little bit of relief.
Yeah. Then in August 2019, the incision started to leak and another surgery, another setback. How did you keep going as a caregiver when it feels like you take 3 steps forward and 5 steps back?
Yeah, so that was after they put the artificial bone in, and then the incision, had another infection, and they actually had to take the piece of bone out, which was incredibly disappointing because that was going to be the kind of last major surgery, was putting, the bone back in, and that was something we looked forward to tentatively because it is a major surgery, but it was also a checkpoint, and the whole recovery of this thing. And, it didn't take, so they had to take the bone out, do another treatment of, the IV antibiotics, um, a shorter stint in rehab, because she did come a long way and she was still pretty with it, but they wanted her there for a little bit just to make sure she was walking safely, and she could be home for small amounts of time, alone and be okay to go
Right.
to, bathroom and stuff like that.
And at that point, was she talking or no?
At that point, yes, yes, under strain, it wasn't easy for her at that point.
Right.
Um, the conversations were kind of broken up, and you could kind of get. I found it easier than other people would have. So a lot of the doctor visits and a lot of the talking with the therapists and stuff, she looked at me a lot to kind of answer some of the questions that she couldn't get out.
Right. Right.
Yeah, conversational from my point of view, but it was very hard for some people to understand her.
So Krista couldn't talk for 2 years. She says all she did was sit in the backyard and look at birds. As her husband, what was that like?
Well, it was progressive as well. It started as like kind of like a game of 20 questions, when she needed something. She was able to nod, eventually to kind of do yes and no's, but she couldn't get anything more complicated out than that, for a long time. So, I mean, it was, as an example, is it something in the house? And she would nod, yes. And is it upstairs? No. Is it downstairs? Yes. Is it food? Yes. And we could kind of figure it out, like that. Um, during that whole stretch, there was still a lot of doctor visits, a lot of therapy visits, um, stuff like that that I had to kind of just be really on my game with, what medication she was taking, and, how she's been, as far as like her baseline and, positive, negative, this was good, this kind of went backwards. She hasn't been eating, or she hasn't been sleeping, or she's been sleeping a lot, whatever it was, I really had to be on my game. And it was very difficult to, one, know, sometimes the right thing to do for her, and also manage my own, emotions with trying to like keep her as safe as I could. I remember, when you say baby steps, it's true. When she's asked to walk to the mailbox, I'm like, of course you can walk to the mailbox, but I secretly, and I'm watching her out the window to see if she falls or something like that.
Right.
It was very progressive, and we had to figure some things out. We kind of learned some things that didn't work, learned some things that worked, and we made it through. But it was again, there was no snap moments where she was able to talk again. It was all very progressive. And we kind of had to learn at each step.
Speaking of this situation, Was this something that you learned through therapy? Doctors, were they the ones that maybe, or other people like told you, hey, ask the questions, let her nod, or this means that, or that means this, or is this something you guys just figured out on your own?
A lot of it was figuring it out on our own, because we didn't always know what questions to ask, the doctors or the therapists and stuff like that. We didn't know what we didn't know at that point. Right now it kind of seems like we're experts, but, at that point, like I said, we just didn't know what we didn't even know yet.